Today, I'm thrilled to share with you the beginning of one of my favorite series from my childhood and young adult years. Septimus Heap, Book 1 Magic by Angie Sage, published by HarperCollins. This magical adventure was held a special place in my heart for years, and I'm excited to bring it to life again through this read aloud. We're going to start with chapter 1 through 3, and I'm going to do it in 3 parts until we get to the end. I hope you enjoy this journey with me and enjoy this incredible story with charm, humor, and wonder of the incredible world that Angie has been able to create and develop. Septimus Heap, Book 1, Magic, written by Angie Sage. Chapter 1, Something in the Snow. Silas Heap pulled his cloak tightly around him against the snow. It had been a long walk through the forest, and he was chilled to the bone. But in his pockets he had the herbs that Galen, the physic woman, had given him for his new baby boy, Septimus, who had been born earlier that day. Silas drew closer to the castle, and he could see the lights flickering through the trees as candles were placed in the windows of tall, narrow houses, clustered along the outside walls. It was the longest night of the year, and the candles would be kept burning until dawn, to help keep the dark at bay. Silas always loved this walk to the castle. He had no fear of the forest by day, and enjoyed the peaceful walk along the narrow track that threaded its way through the dense trees for miles after mile. He was near the edge of the forest now. The tall trees had begun to thin out, and as the track began to dip down the valley floor, Silas could see the whole castle spread before him. The old walls hugged the wide, winding river and zigzagged around the higgledy-piggledy clumps of houses. All the houses were painted bright colors, and those that faced west looked as if they were on fire as their windows caught the last of the sun's rays. The castle had started life as a small village. Being so near to the forest, the villagers had put up small, tall stone walls for protection against the wolverines, witches, and warlocks who thought nothing of stealing their sheep, chickens, and occasionally their children. As more houses were built, the walls were extended and a deep moat was dug so that all could feel safe. Soon the castle was attracting skilled craftsmen from other villages. It grew and prospered so much that the inhabitants began to run out of space until some decided to build the Ramblings. The Ramblings, which was where Silas, Sarah, and the boys lived, was a huge stone building that rose up along the riverside. It sprawled for 3 miles along the river and back again into the castle, and was a noisy, busy place filled with warren and passages and rooms and small factories, schools, and shops, mixed with family rooms, tiny roof gardens, and even a theater. There was not much space in the Ramblings, though, but people did not mind. There was always good company and someone for the children to play with. As the winter sun sank below the castle walls, Silas quickened his pace. He needed to get to the north gate before they locked it and pulled up the drawbridge at nightfall. It was then Silas sensed something nearby. Something alive, but only just. He was aware of a small human heartbeat somewhere close to him. Silas stopped, and as an ordinary wizard, he was able to sense things. But as he was not particularly good ordinary wizard, he needed to concentrate hard. He stood still with the snow falling fast around him, already covering his footprints, and then he heard something. A snuffle. A whimper. A small breath. He wasn't sure, but it was enough. Underneath a bush beside the path was a bundle. Silas picked up the bundle and, to his amazement, found himself gazing into the solemn eyes of a tiny baby. Silas cradled the baby in his arms and wondered how she'd come to be lying in the snow on the coldest day of the year. Someone had wrapped her up tightly in a heavy woolen blanket, but she was already very cold. Her lips were a dusky blue and the snow dusted her eyelashes, as the baby's dark violet eyes gazed intently at him. Silas had an uncomfortable feeling that she had already seen things in her short life that no baby should see. Thinking of his Sarah at home, warm and safe with Septimus and the boys, Silas decided that they would just have to make room for one more little. He carefully tucked the baby into his blue wizard cloak and held her close to him as he ran toward the castle gate. He reached the drawbridge just as Gringe, the gatekeeper, was about to go and yell for the bridge boy to start winding it up. "You're cutting it a bit fine," growled Gringe, "but you wizards are weird. What do y'all want to be out for on a day like this? I don't know." Oh, Silas wanted to get past Gringe's. He could be as soon as he could. But first he had to cross Gringe's palm with silver. Silas quickly found a silver penny in one of his pockets and handed it over. "Thank you, Gringe. Good night." Gringe looked at the penny as though it were a rather nasty beetle. "Marcia Overstrand, she gave me half a crown just now. But she's got class, with her being the extraordinary wizard now." "What?" Silas nearly choked. "Yeah, class, that's what she's got." Grinch stood back to let him pass, and Silas slipped by. As much as Silas wanted to find out about Marcia Overstrand was suddenly the extraordinary wizard, he could feel the bundle begin to stir in the warmth of his cloak, and something told him that it would be better if Grinch did not know about the baby. As Silas disappeared in the shadows of the tunnel that led to the ramblings, a tall figure in purple stepped out and barred his way. "Marcia!" gasped Silas. "What on earth?" "Tell no one you found her. She was born to you, understand?" Shocked Silas nodded, but he had no time to say anything. Marcia was gone in a shimmer of purple mist. Silas spent the rest of the long, winding journey through the ramblings with his mind in turmoil. Who was this baby? What did Marcia have to do with her? And why was Marcia the extraordinary wizard now? And as Silas neared the big red door that led to the Heap's family's already overcrowded room, another more pressing question came into his mind. What was Sarah going to say about yet another baby to take care for? Silas did not have long to think about that last question. As he reached the door, it flew open, and a large red-faced woman wearing dark blue robes of a matron midwife ran out, almost knocking Silas over as she fled. She too was carrying a bundle, but the bundle was wrapped from head to toe in bandages, and as she was carrying him under her arm as if it were a parcel and she was late for the post. "Dad!" cried the matron midwife. She pushed Silas aside for a powerful shove and ran down the corridor inside the room. Sarah Heap screamed. Silas went into the heavy heart. He saw Sarah surrounded by 6 white-faced little boys, all too scared to cry. "She's taken him," said Sarah hopelessly. "Septimus is dead, and she's taken him away." At that moment, a warm wetness spread out from the bundle that Silas still had hidden under the cloak. Silas had no words for what he wanted to say, so he just took the bundle out from under his cloak and placed her in Sarah's arms. Sarah Heap burst into tears. Chapter 2. Sarah and Silas. The bundle settled down into the Heap household and was called Jenna after Silas's mother. The youngest of the boys, Nico, was only 2 when Jenna arrived, and he soon forgot about his brother Septimus. The older boys slowly forgot too. They loved their little baby sister and brought home all kinds of treasures for her from magic classes at school. Sarah and Silas, of course, could not forget about Septimus. Silas blamed himself for leaving Sarah alone while he went out to fetch the baby's herbs from the physic woman. Sarah just blamed herself for everything, although she could hardly remember what happened that terrible day. Sarah knew she had tried to breathe life back into her baby and he had failed. And she remembered watching the matron midwife wrapping her little Septimus from head to toe in bandages and running to the door shouting over her head, "Dead." Sarah remembered all that, all right. But Sarah soon loved her little baby girl as much as she had loved Septimus. For a while she was afraid that someone would come and take Jenna away. But as the months passed and Jenna grew into a chubby, gurgling baby, Sarah relaxed and almost stopped worrying, until one day when her best friend Sally Mulligan arrived, breathless at the doorstep. Sally Mullen was one of those people who knew everything that was going on in the castle. She was a small, busy woman with whispery ginger hair that was forever escaping from her somehow grubby cook's hat. She had a pleasant round face, a little chubby from finishing off too many cakes. Her clothes were generally covered in sprinkles of flour. Sally ran a small cafe down on the pontoon beside the river. The sign over the door announced, "Sally Mullen, Tea and Ale House. Clean accommodations available, no riffraff." There was no secrets in Sally Mullen's cafe. Anyone arriving at the castle by water was noticed and commented on. Most people coming to the castle did prefer to arrive on boat. No one apart from the Silas liked the dark tracks through the forest that surrounded by the castle. The forest still had a bad wolverine problem at night and was infested with carnivorous trees. And then there were the wind-drawn witches, who were already short on cash, and had been known to set traps for the unwary traveler and leave them with little more than their shirt and socks. Sally Mullen's cafe was a busy, streaming hut perched precariously on the water. All shapes and sizes of boats would moor up on the cafe pontoon, and all sorts of people, animals would tumble on out of them. Most decided to recover from the trip by having at least one of Sally's fierce beers and a slab of barley cake, by telling the latest gossip, and anyone in the castle with half an hour to spare and a rumbling tummy would soon find themselves on the well-trodden path down to the port gate, past the riverside amenity rubbish dump, and along the pontoon to Sally Mullen's Teal Ale and House. Sally Mullen made it to her business to see Sarah every week and keep her up to date with everything. In Sally's opinion, Sarah was much put upon with 7 children to care for, not to mention Silas Heap, who did very little as far as she could see. Stories usually involved people Sarah had never heard of, and would never meet, but Sarah looked forward to Sally's visits all the same, enjoying hearing about what's going on around her. However, this time, what Sally had to tell her was different. This was more serious than everyday gossip, and this time it did not involve Sarah. And for the first time ever, Sarah knew something about it that Sally did not. Sally swept in and closed the door conspiratorially behind her. "I've got some terrible news," she whispered. Sarah, who was trying to wipe breakfast from Jenna's face and everywhere else that the baby had sprayed it and clean up after the new wolfhound puppy, all at the same time, was not really listening. "Hello, Sally," she said. "There's clean space here. Come on and sit down. Cup of tea?" "Yes, please, Sarah." "Can you believe this?" "What's that then, Sally?" asked Sarah, expecting to hear about the latest bad behavior in the cafe. The Queen is dead!" "What?" gasped Sarah. She lifted Jenna out of her chair and took her over to the corner of the room where her baby basket was. Sarah laid Jenna down for a nap. She believed that the baby should be kept away from bad news. "Dead," repeated Sally unhappily. "No," gasped Sarah. "I don't believe it. She's just not well after her baby's birth. That's why she's not been since then." "That's what the custodian guards have been saying, isn't it?" asked Sally. "Well, yes," admitted Sarah, pouring out the tea, "but they are her bodyguards and they must know. Though why the Queen is suddenly choosing to be guarded by such a bunch of thugs, I don't understand." Sally took the cup of tea that Sarah had placed in front of her. Lovely. "Well, exactly." Sally lowered her voice and looked around as if though expecting to find a custodian guard propped up in the corner. Not that she unnecessarily would have noticed one amid the mess the Heaps room. They are a bunch of thugs. In fact, they're the ones who killed her. "Killed? She was killed?" exclaimed Sarah. "Shh!" "Well, see here." Sally pulled her chair close to Sarah. "There's a story going around, and I have it from the horse's mouth." "Which horse would that be, then?" asked Sarah with a wry smile. "Only Madame Marcia." Looking triumphant, Sally sat back and folded her arms. "That's who." "What? How come you've been mixing with the extraordinary wizard? Did she drop by for a cup of tea?" "Almost. Terry Tarsal did. He had been up to the wizard tower delivering some really weird shoes that he had made for Madame Marcia. So when he had stopped moaning about her taste in shoes and how much he hated snakes, he said that he had overheard Marcia talking to one of the other wizards indoor. That little fat one, I think. Well, they said the queen had been shot by the custodian guards and one of the assassins. Sarah could not believe what she was hearing. When? She breathed. Well, this is the really awful thing, whispered Sally, excitedly. They said they was shot on the day her baby was born 6 whole months ago, and we knew nothing about it. It's terrible. Terrible! They shot Mr. Arthur too, dead. That's how come Marcia took over. Arthur's dead? Gasped Marcia. I can't believe it. I really can't. We all thought he'd retired. Silas was his apprentice years ago. He was lovely. Was he? Asked Sally vaguely, eager to get on with the story. Well, that's not all, see. Because Terry reckoned that Marcia had rescued the princess and taken her away somewhere. Endor and Marcia were just chatting, really. Wondering how she was getting along. Because of course they realized Terry was there with the shoes. They stopped. Marcia was very rude to him. He said he felt a bit of strange afterwards. He reckoned she hit him with a forget spell on him. But he nipped behind a pillar when he saw her muttering it didn't take properly. He was really upset about that, as he can't remember whether she paid him for the shoes or not. Sally Mullen paused to draw a breath and have a large gulp of tea. That poor little princess. God help that little one. I wonder where she is now. Properly wasting away in some dungeon somewhere. Not like your little angel over there. How is she doing? Oh, she's doing fine, said Sarah, who usually would have talked lengths about Jenna's snuffles and new tooth and how she could spit up and hold her own cup now. But just at that moment, Sarah wanted to turn the attention away from Jenna because Sarah had spent the last 6 months wondering who her baby really was. And now she knew. Jenna was, thought Sarah. Surely she must be the baby princess. For once, Sarah was glad to wave goodbye to Sally Mullen. She watched her bustle off down the corridor, and as Sarah closed the door behind her, she breathed a sigh of relief. Then she rushed over to Jenna's basket. Sarah lifted Jenna up and held her into her arms. Jenna smiled at Sarah and reached out to grab her charm necklace. Well, this little princess, murmured Sarah. I always knew you were special, but I never dreamed you were our own princess. The baby's dark violet eyes met Sarah's and gaze, and she looked solemnly at Sarah, as if to say, well, now you know. Sarah genuinely laid Jenna back into her baby's basket. Gently. Her head was spinning as her hands shook in her as she poured herself another cup of tea. She found it as hard to believe that she had heard the queen was dead, and Arthur too. Their Jenna was the heir to the castle, the princess. What was happening? Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon torn between gazing at Jenna, Princess Jenna, and worrying about what would happen if anyone found out where she was. Where was Silas when she needed him? Silas was enjoying a day's fishing with the boys. There was a small sandy beach in the bend of the river just longer from the shamblings. Silas was showing Nico and Jojo, the 2 youngest boys, how to tie their jam jars onto the end of a pole and dip them into the water. Jojo had already caught 3 tittlers, but Nico kept dropping his and was getting upset. Silas picked Nico up and took him over to see Eric and Ed, the 5-year-old twins. Eric was daydreaming happily and dangling his foot in the warm, clear water. Ed was poking at something under a stone with a stick. It was a huge water beetle. Nico wailed and clung on tightly around Silas's neck. Sam, who was nearly 7, was a serious fisherman. He had been given a proper fishing rod for his last birthday, and there were 2 small silver fish laid out on the rock beside him. He was about to reel in another. Nico squealed in excitement. "Take him away, Dad! He'll frighten the fish!" Sam said crossly. Silas tiptoed off with Nico and went to sit beside his oldest son, Simon. Simon had a fishing rod in one hand and a book in the other. It was Simon's ambition to be the extraordinary wizard, and he was busy reading all of Silas's old magic books. This one, Silas noticed, was called The Complete Fish Charmer. Silas expected all of his boys to be some kind of wizard. It was in the family. Silas's aunt was a renowned white witch, and both Silas's father and uncle had been shapeshifters, which is a very specialized branch, and one that Silas hoped his boys would avoid. For something, shapeshifters become increasingly unstable as they grow older, sometimes unable to hold their own shape for more than a few minutes at a time. Silas's father had eventually disappeared into the forest as a tree, but no one knew which one. It was one of the reasons why Silas enjoyed his walks through the forest. He would often address a remark to an untidy-looking tree in hopes that it might be his father. Sarah Heap came from a warlock and wizard family. As a girl, Sarah had studied herbs and healing with Galen, the physics woman in the forest, which was why she had met Silas one day. Silas had been out looking for his father. He was lost and unhappy, and Sarah took him back with her to see Galen. Galen had helped Silas to understand that his father, as a shapeshifter, would have chosen his final destination as a tree many years ago, and would now be truly happy. And as Silas, too, for the first time in his life, realized that he felt truly happy sitting next to Sarah by the physic woman's fire. When Sarah understood all she could about herbs and healing, she had said a fond goodbye to the Galen and joined Silas in his rooms in the Ramblings. And there they had stayed ever since, squeezing in more and more children, while Silas happily gave up his apprenticeship and worked as a jobbing ordinary wizard to pay the bills. Sarah made herbs tinctures at the kitchen table where she had a spare moment, which did not often happen. That evening, as Silas and the boys made their way up to the beach steps to go back to the Ramblings, a large and menacing custodian guard, dressed in black from head to toe, barred their way. "Halt!" he barked. Nico started to cry. Silas stopped and told the boys to behave. "Papers!" shouted the guard. "Where are your papers?" Silas stared at him. "What papers?" he asked quietly, not wanting to cause trouble with the 6 tired boys around him, needing to go home for supper. "Your papers, wizard scum! The beach area is forbidden to all without the required papers," sneered the guard. Silas was shocked. If he had not been with the boys, he would have argued, but he had noticed the pistol that the guard was carrying. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know." The guard looked them all up and down, as if deciding what to do, but luckily for Silas, he had other people to go and terrorize. "Take your rabble out of here, and don't come back," snapped the guard. "Stay where you belong." Silas hurried the shocked boys away from the steps into the safety of the Ramblings. Sam dropped his fish and started to sob. There, Silas said. "It's all right." But Silas felt that there was most certainly not all right. What was going on? "Why did he call us wizard scum, Dad?" asked Simon. "Wizards are the best, aren't they?" "Yes," said Silas distractedly, "the best." But the trouble is not, thought Silas. There was no hiding it. If you were a wizard, all wizards and only wizards had them. Silas had them, Sarah had them, and all the boys except for Nico and Jojo had them. And as soon as Nico and Jojo went to the magic class in school, they would have them too. Slowly but surely, until there was no mistaking it, a wizard child's eyes would turn green when he or she was exposed to magic learning. It had always been something to be proud of, until now, when suddenly it felt dangerous. That evening, when at long last all the children were asleep, Silas and Sarah talked late into the night. They talked about their princess and the wizard boys and the changes that had overtaken the castle. They discussed escaping to the Mara Marshes or going into the forest and living with Galen. By the time dawn broke and last they fell asleep, Silas and Sarah had decided to do what the Heaps usually did: muddle through and hope for the best. And so for the next 9.5 years, Silas and Sarah kept quiet. They locked and barred their door. They spoke to only their neighbors and those they could trust, and when the magic classes were stopped at school, they taught their children magic at home and in the evenings. And that is why, 9.5 years later, all the Heaps except for one had piercing green eyes. Chapter 3. The Supreme Custodian. It was 6 in the morning, still dark, 10 years to the day since Silas had found the bundle. At the end of corridor 223, behind the big black door with the number 16 stamped on it by the numerical patron, the Heap household slept peacefully. Jenna lay curled up snugly in her small box bed that Silas had made for her from the driftwood washed up along the riverbank. The bed was built neatly into a big cupboard leading off of a large room, which was in fact the only room the Heaps possessed. Jenna loved her cupboard bed. Sarah had made her some bright patchwork curtains that Jenna could draw around the bed to keep out both the cold and her noisy brothers. Best of all, she had a small window in the wall above her pillow that looked out into the river. If Jenna couldn't sleep, she would gaze out of her window for hours on end, watching the endless varieties of boats that made their way to and from the castle, and sometimes on the clear, dark nights she loved to count the stars until she fell fast asleep. The large room was the place where all the Heaps lived, cooked, ate, and argued on, occasionally did their homework, and in it was a mess. It was stuffed full of 20 years' worth of clutter that had accumulated since Sarah and Silas had set up home together. There were fishing rods and reels, shoes and socks, ropes and rat traps, bags and bedding, nets and knitting, clothes and cooking pots, books, 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 and yet more books. If you were foolish enough to cast your eye around the Heaps' room hoping to find a space in which to sit, the chances were a book would have found it up first. Everywhere you looked, there were books, on sagging shelves and boxes, hanging in bags from the ceiling, propping up the tables, stacked up in such precarious high piles that they threatened to collapse at any moment. There were story books, herb books, cookery books, boat books, fishing books, but mainly there were hundreds of magic books, which Silas had illegally rescued from the school when magic had been banned a few years back. In the middle of the room was a large hearth from which a tall chimney snaked up into the roof. It held the remains of a fire now grown cold, around which all Heap boys and large dog were asleep in a chaotic pile of quilts and blankets. Sarah and Silas were also fast asleep. They had escaped to the small attic space that Silas had acquired a few years back by a simple means of knocking a hole in the ceiling. After Sarah had declared that she had no longer stand living with 6 growing boys in just one room. But amid all the chaos in the big room, a small island of tidiness stood out. A long and rather wobbly table was covered with a clean white cloth. On it was placed 9 plates and a mug, and at the head of the table was a small chair decorated with winter berries and leaves. On the table in front of the chair, a small present, carefully wrapped in colorful paper, tied with a red ribbon, had been placed ready for Jenna to open on her 10th birthday. All was quiet and still as the Heap household slept peacefully on through the last hours of darkness before the winter sun was due to rise. However, on the other side of the castle, in the palace of the custodian slept, peacefully or not, had been abandoned. The supreme custodian had been called from his bed and had, with the help of the night servant, Hurley put on his black fur-trimmed tunic and heavy black and gold cloak, and he had instructed the night servant how to lace up his embroidered silk shoes. Then he himself had carefully placed a beautiful crown upon his head. The supreme custodian was never seen without the crown, which still had a dent in it from the day it had fallen from the queen's head and crashed to the stone floor. The crown sat crookedly on his slightly pointed bald head, but the night servant, being new and terrified, did not dare tell him. The supreme custodian strode briskly down the corridor to the throne room. He was a small, rat-like man with pale, almost colorless eyes and a complicated goatee beard that he was in the habit of spending many hours tending. He was almost swamped by his voluminous cloak, which was heavily entrusted with military badges, and his appearance was mainly fainted ridiculous by his crooked and slightly feminine crown. But had you seen him that morning, you would have not laughed. You would have shrunk back into the shadow and hoped he would not notice you, for the Supreme Custodian carried with him a very powerful air of menace. The night servant helped the Supreme Custodian arrange himself on the ornate throne in the throne room. He was then waved impatiently away, scuttled off gracefully, his shift narrowly over. The chill morning air lay heavily in the throne room. The Supreme Custodian sat impassively on the throne, but his breath, which misted to the cold air in most quick bursts, betrayed his excitement. He did not have long to wait before a tall young woman, wearing the severe black cloak and deep red tunic of an assassin, walked briskly in and bowed low, her long slashed sleeves sweeping across the stone floor. "The Queenling, my lord. She has been found," the assassin said in a low voice. The Supreme Custodian sat up and stared at the assassin with his pale eyes. "Are you sure?" "I want no mistakes this time," he said menacingly. "Our spy, my lord, he has suspected a child for a while. She considers her to be a stranger in her family. Yesterday, our spy found out that the child is of age." "What age exactly?" 10 years old today, my lord." "Really?" The Supreme Custodian sat back in the throne and considered what the assassin had said. "I have a likeness of the child here, my lord. I understand. She is much like her mother, the ex-queen." From inside her tunic, the assassin took a small piece of paper. On it was a skillfully drawing of a young girl with the dark violet eyes and long dark hair. The Supreme Custodian took the drawing. It was true. The girl did look remarkably like the dead queen. He came to a swift decision and clicked his bony fingers loudly. The assassin inclined her head. "My lord, tonight, midnight, you are to pay a visit to where is it? Room 16, corridor 223, my lord. Family name. Heap, my lord. Ah. Take this silver pistol. How many in the family?" 9, my lord, including the child. "And 9 bullets in case of trouble. Silver for the child, and bring her to me. I want proof." The young woman looked pale. It was her first and only test. There were no second chances for an assassin. "Yes, my lord." She bowed briefly and withdrew her pistol, shaking. In a quiet corner of the throne room, the ghost of Arthur Mello eased himself up from the cold stone bench he had been sitting on. He sighed and stretched out his ghostly legs. Then he gathered his faded purple robes around him, took a deep breath, and walked out through the thick stone wall of the throne room. Outside, he found himself hovering 60 feet above the ground in the dark morning air. Instead of walking off in a dignified manner, as a ghost of his age and status really should, Arthur stuck his arms out like wings of a bird and swooped gracefully through the falling snow. Flying was about the only thing Arthur liked about being a ghost. Flying, or the lost art of flight, was something that a modern extraordinary wizard could no longer do. Even Mahlia, who was determined to fly, could do no more than a quick hover before crashing to the ground. Somewhere, somehow, the secret had been lost. But all the ghosts could of course fly, and since he had been a ghost, Arthur had lost his crippling fear of heights and had spent many exciting hours perfecting his acrobatic moves. But there wasn't much else about being a ghost that he enjoyed. Sitting in the throne room where he had actually become one, and consequently where he had to spend the first year and day of his ghosthood, was one of the least favorite occupations, but it had to be done. Arthur made it his business to know what the custodians were planning to try and keep Mahlia up to date. With his help, she managed to stay one step ahead of the custodians and keep Jenna safe until now. Over the years since the death of the Queen, the Supreme Custodian had become more and more desperate to track down the princess. Every year he would make a long and much dreaded trip to the Badlands, where he would have to report his progress to the certain extraordinary wizard turned necromancer, Dom Daniel. It was Dom Daniel who had sent the first assassin to kill the Queen. and it was Dom Daniel who had installed the Supreme Custodians and his henchmen to scour the castle and search for the princess. For while the princess remained in the castle, Dom Daniel dared not to come near. And so every year the Supreme Custodian would promise Dom Daniel that this year would be the successful. This year he would get rid of the Queenling and at last deliver the castle up to his rightful master, Dom Daniel. And this was why, as Arthur left the throne room, the Supreme Custodian wore what his mother would have called a silly grin on his face. At last he had done the job he was sent to do. Of course, he thought, his silly grin changing to a smug smile, it was only due to the superior intelligence and talent that he had discovered that girl. But it wasn't. It was due to a bizarre stroke of luck. When the Supreme Custodian took over the castle, one of the first things he did was to ban women from the courthouse, the ladies' washroom, which was no longer needed. He eventually became a small committee room. During the past bitterly cold month, the committee of the custodians had taken to be meeting in the former ladies' washroom, which had the great advantage of a wood-burning stove, rather than the cavernous custodian committee room, where the chill wind whistled through and froze their feet to blocks of ice. And as so unknowingly, for once, the custodians were one step ahead of Arthur Mello. As a ghost, Arthur could only go to places he had been to in his lifetime. And as a well-brought-up young wizard, Arthur had never set foot in the ladies' washroom in his life. The most he was able to do was hover outside, waiting just as he had done when he was alive and courting Judge Alice Nettles. It had been late one particularly cold afternoon a few weeks ago when Arthur had watched the custodian committee take themselves into the ladies' washroom. The heavy door with ladies still visible in the faded gold letterings was slammed behind them, and Arthur hovered outside with his ear to the door, trying to hear what was going on. But try as he might, he was not able to hear. The committee decided to send their very best spy, Linda Lane, on her interests in herbs and healing to live in the room 17, corridor 223, right next door to the Heaps. And so neither Arthur nor the Heaps had any idea that their new neighbor was a spy, and a very good one, too. As Arthur Mello flew through the snowy air, pondering how to save the princess, he absent-mindedly turned almost two perfect double loops before he dived swiftly through the drifting snowflakes to reach the golden pyramid that crowned the wizard tower. Arthur landed gracefully on his feet. For a moment he stood perfectly balanced on the tips of his toes. Then he raised his arms above his head and spun around faster and faster until he started to sink slowly through the roof and down into the room below, where he misjudged his landing and fell through the canopy of Marcia Overstrand's four-poster bed. Marcia sat up in a fright. Arthur sprawled on her pillow, looking embarrassed. "Sorry, Marcia. Very ungallant. Well, at least you haven't got your curlers in." "My hair is naturally curly, thank you, Arthur," said Marcia crossly. "You might have waited